I wonder how many of us have felt like we were in that death valley like Ezekiel over the last year. Let's face it, many of us were trying to learn and wrangle new technologies to stay connected to loved ones and education systems and work and, yes, even church. At times, I admit, I felt scattered, like I was dwelling in a cave all alone, almost as if our entire humanity was being forced into an exodus. And at times, it might have seemed, at least to me, like God was so very far away, out of reach. But God's breath still hovers over us and creates opportunities to continue to show up and be the hands and feet of good news. Yes, good news. So like the zombie story from Scripture today, you did realize there were zombies in the Bible, right? And you did realize that zombies are a good thing in the Bible, right? I am a huge Walking Dead fan. I find there's loads of ethics in its violent upheaval of a story. What would I do? I ask myself often as I watch an episode. How would I react when all of the world shuts down? All the world changes because of a virus that's running rampant and changing all that I know. It's kind of eerie, isn't it? How close that show became in the last year. I am fortunate, I know, to know so very little of this scene which Ezekiel encountered in the vision before us. One can only imagine the devastation which must have preceded what resulted in a valley full of dry bones. No, indeed, the closest I can come to comprehending such as this, at least in a literal sense, is by perusing history. I remember a time when I wandered the fields of Gettysburg, haunted by how 7,000 died on the doorstep of this small town and how many were hurriedly buried. They weren't really buried, but buried by comrades in graves so shallow that they offered little or no protection from the elements. We know, of course, that their stories don't end there for mothers and dads and wives and fiancés on both sides of the battle. They had their way when it came to exhuming their bodies and having them buried once more in places far more fitting. It all came back again, didn't it? I am fortunate, I know, that I know so little of what is before us now. I have grieved my share of dear ones, yes, and I have stood alongside countless others when called upon to speak words of comfort and promise before coffins were lowered or ashes were scattered. I have to say, though, I could not help but compare the scene with which Ezekiel was dropped down into the orderly rows of gravestones in the cemetery for a time in my not-so-distant past where I lived in a condo, and my patio, when I went out the door, it overlooked a large, sprawling cemetery. And even those whose loved ones have long since joined them so that no one who remembers them stops anymore. Even for them, the grass around the headstones is trimmed so that anyone interested can pause, make out their names and the years their lives grace this planet. And I have also adorned myself as I have taken walks through the interesting and historical tombs of New Orleans. They're old and they're weathered and they're beckoning with their own ghosts, and each edifice tells an incredible story. And yet, while I know so little of genocide firsthand, the image that Ezekiel shares is not nearly so rare as one might hope. In modern day cases of genocide, it happens over and over and over again that one group so values not even this much the basic humanity of the other that their remains are not given the respect that one would ordinarily render. Just think of Darfur or Rwanda, Bosnia, Cambodia, the Jewish Holocaust, Native Americans. This was surely the case in the time that Ezekiel lived and prophesied. I am told that evidence has been discovered to show that it was typical for conquering armies to simply leave the vanquished to rot where they had fallen. It would have been, of course, the last indignity that could be visited upon them. Indeed, that valley of dry bones which dominated Ezekiel's vision is not something unheard of in that time, in that place, and yet even the vivid vision stood in for something else. For those dry bones symbolize all that the people of Israel lost when their national and religious symbols were destroyed, when their leaders were carried off into exile, when the rest were left to make do in a land that's been torn apart by war. They must have believed themselves, their present and their past and their future, like those dry bones, to be not only dead, but dead beyond any hope. Now, surely it is difficult to find any comparable experience in the world that I inhabit now. I mean, the list that I went through a few moments ago has many more situations than just those. I cast around trying to see if I've ever been that bereft of hope, at least in any way that matters in the ultimate or permanent sense. I watch the news with all of you, and again, I see evidence of our differences and our distance from one another along racial lines, all across our country, along political lines, across sexual orientation lines, across gender lines, across technology lines, across education lines. And yes, this is every bit as true in the community where I live and serve in Texas as it is probably for you in Kentucky. And oh no, it would not be stretching the truth too far at all to say that even here, while in many cases we live within mere blocks of one another, our experiences of the world differ profoundly. So much so that I expect we have almost forgotten that it is ours to try to shape a different world. Or at least this has been the case for me. And it feels dry, like those sticks we were rolling, harsh and barren and hopeless. But is it possible to suggest, as did the ancient Ezekiel, that God's Spirit of life is moving among the dusty, dry landscape of our siloed, divided selves? Is God breathing over this viral, created valley of disaster and death where we find ourselves located? It seems to me that we are learning in this valley. No, not about new forms of community, but about God's way to always make a way, even in the midst of the shadow of death. We are parched, we are lonely, we have doubts, we live anxiously. This is the same soul space occupied by the people of Israel with whom the prophet Ezekiel's vision is cast. They too had dry bones strewn about, a dry period of life, disconnected and brittle.
Bone lay scattered and artifactual, wind-rowed like dead branches whose tree bodies repeat the desiccation, all hope bleached, lost. Living moisture evaporated calcified memories of what was, or seeds of what could be. Wandering shards of vessels, once thrummed with pure energy where honor and dishonor wrestled. Stripped of living water to walk the hills, needing only gravity to line the valley, it was never about the bones anyway. Rather a glimpse of pure power, a reminder of who's in charge of restoration. Real hope lies in the source.
Such wonderfully alive words, his poem. And it begs the question of us, what can our spiritual dry bones teach us in these days? I wonder what we will collectively learn about relationships during this difficult valley time. What we will learn about how the earth worked on healing herself while we stay locked behind doors. How the waters of our oceans were clear because manufacturing and vacationers were landlocked. How we choose to creatively rise up with life from our cracked selves, or how we lay down in defeat. How we sang from alleyways and yards and porches, and artists use rooftops to entertain and give lessons and read stories and sonnets, all without a steep price tag for admittance. How we didn't gather to cheer on our sports teams, but instead leagues and celebrities raised money for charities and communities, and hotel chains opened their doors for medical personnel and the displaced. It has been a faltering start, to be sure, this revival of humanity, and it would surely be easy to just walk away from, or better yet, cover up the dry bones which so reflect what has surely been between us. Only the breath of God somehow keeps on blowing. And we keep showing up, and we keep trying. So do these bones have sinews and flesh and life in them again? or is it that yet to be seen? In some ways, it feels as though we're learning to do this for the first time all over while our muscle memory is trying to kick in again. I can only imagine this was also so in the vision Ezekiel offers now. It was surely so when the people of Israel returned home and they tried to make sense of their lives once more in that time and place. Yes, for now it may be so that all I know for sure is this, that these bones seemed pretty dead. My bones feel a little dead. It could only be something as powerful as God's own breath, which could have brought us even this far. We could look across the valley of dry bones we are traveling in this time in human history, and like the ancients in our text, be uncertain about our future, unclear if life or even hope will emerge. But as Voltaire penned in the 18th century, it is not more surprising to be born twice than once. Everything in nature is resurrection. We follow a God who always makes a way, a God who is up to creation, fashioning light from dark, forming out of voids and chaos the goodness of a world teeming with life. And this vision before us should give us a reminder in our viral exile that we have put upon us, that we are still in, that we are figuring out as we move and into our being again. Bones will live. This is the promise of God. I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. Life will happen. Hope is on the horizon. Mercy is being offered for our dry and our parched lives. Real hope offered from the source of all life. That is something to shout thanks be to God. So today I am inviting you to pause and reflect in these moments with those near you or in your journaling today. What in the congregation of Florence Christian Church seemed dead but is coming back to life? How are you experiencing the breath of God in unlikely places? And for our families with children, how do you want to be helpful in the coming weeks? Start asking yourselves together, do you know someone who needs an infusion of life and hope? Make a list of how you can help, like gathering dog toys for the animal shelter, like putting together bags of socks and water bottles and granola bars to hand out to those on the street who have no home, like committing to read to children in at-risk programs, like serving lemonade on a hot day. I hope that you will talk and reflect about these questions over lunch today, because you know what, church? The bones are rising up. The muscle memory is coming back. Church, we're called to move, even when we feel dry and faltering and uncertain, so that we might begin to live into the Easter story of new life. And that is good news indeed.